Welcome everybody to the Castair University. Today we're going to do a valve swap. So in one of the previous videos I went through some of the symptoms of the 70-pound safety valves popping, and this would go along with that video in terms of how to access the valves that are causing that problem or symptom. So at Castair we make a valve tool that's specific to our pump, and it works on a lot of other pumps. But again, if that 70-pound safety valve is popping, we got to examine and look at the back three valves on the pump. So the first thing you need to do is get this tool. Up here on the top of the compressor pumps, we have 5 valves per head. You have your 2 intake valves, you have a low pressure discharge, you have a high pressure intake, and a high pressure discharge. So if that 70-pound safety valve's popping, it's going to be one of these back 3 valves. Now on these back 3 valves, they do have a bolt with a large washer cover hold down setup. Once you remove this bolt and knock that big washer free, it's going to look identical to these front 2 plugs. This is what you're going to see below that cap once you get that bolt out and remove that cap, guys. So now we're going to go in, and I've loosened this, so it won't be this loose in the video or when you do it in the field. But for the video and time's sake, I already pre-loosened it. You just get a wrench on there, and if you got to get a breaker bar, you get a breaker bar. You loosen that. You can take this off now that it's loose. And just unthread the valve retainer plug. So one thing I want to mention, guys, when you're doing these valves, keep in mind the valves almost look identical and it's really hard to tell them apart. So the big takeaway is do each valve individually. When you buy a valve overhaul kit from Castair, we'll have each valve labeled individually so you'll know what valve based on the break-in goes where. But one thing that isn't labeled that you have to pay attention to is how the valves are sitting in that hold downer in that valve retainer spot. So basically when you look down in there, and I'll pull it out and show you, this is what you get when you take it out. Okay, so there is the low pressure intake valve removed. So like I said, all the valves look really similar. All the intake valves have a nut. The discharge valves do not have a nut on them. That's the only way you can tell them apart. But going from high pressure intake to low pressure intake, they look identical. So like I said, do the valves individually and one at a time. The other super important critical thing to bring up in this valve change or checking your valves, this valve came out like this with that nut facing up. If you flip it over when you put it back in, that nut can put a hole directly in your piston. So again, the 2 important parts when you're doing a valve overhaul or inspecting and changing your valves on a Castair pump and any brand pump is do them individually and pay attention to how they came out of that pump. This came out just like this with that nut on top. If you put it back in opposite, that can put a hole right in your piston. The other thing to note is the pumps all have a copper washer seat gasket on the bottom of each valve. This is something you're going to want to look at and inspect if you're having a problem with one of the valves. If this is cracked or not making a good seal, meaning it's bent or dented or anything that makes an imperfection that doesn't let this copper ring get a good seal, can be the whole cause of your issue. It might not even be the valve, it might just be this copper gasket. So again, you get the copper gasket, that goes on the valve, you got a valve spacer. That spaces that valve from the top of the head in the retainer plug. Goes directly back in, just like that. Now one thing to note on these valves, what you're looking for is you want to make sure that it can move and seat. So the big takeaway with these valves when you get them out of your head and you're inspecting them is they need to be clean, free of dirt, debris, dust, anything like casting or gasket that would cause it to not be able to move and seat like you see there. That valve needs to be able to open and shut and seal. If there's any debris or the spring behind it's failed where it stays open, that's going to cause that valve to backflow and pop the safety valve like we talked about on the 70-pound safety valve issue popping. So again, these valves, all the valves look the same. You just got to do them individually, take them out one at a time, and pay attention to how you took them out so you put them back in the same way you took them out. If you put them in upside down, that's where you run the risk of putting a hole in your piston. If you get the valves mixed up when you're reinstalling them, it's not going to operate properly either. So now we're going to put that valve back into the head. And again, the back 3 valves, once you remove that bolt and that big washer cover, will have the same setup and look identical as to what we're doing right now. And any questions on this, guys, please don't hesitate. Reach out. My team and I will walk you through it in real time, over the phone, FaceTime, whatever it is to help you guys get up and going. We're going to do that for you. But we take our valve. We know this is an intake valve, so the nut has to face up. The copper washer goes on the bottom of the valve. We drop the valve into the head. Make sure it's all the way down. You can feel it. It's got a specific spot that it sits in. Then we take the valve spacer, put that on top of the valve, get it on top of the valve. Then we grab our valve retainer plug, and that goes back on top. Now on the Castair pump breakdown, we do have all the torque specs for every single nut and bolt on this pump. So please refer to that when you're doing this type of service or maintenance work to make sure you get the proper torque spec on that head bolt or on this pump valve hold down. And that's how you inspect the valves. Thanks again, guys, for joining me today at this Castair University episode, doing a valve check or performing a valve check on your Castair pump.